Flames crackled against a cold sky in Rouen. A 19-year-old girl stood chained to a stake, condemned for heresy. Her name was Joan, and her story is one of history's greatest enigmas. She was an illiterate peasant who heard the voices of saints, a teenage girl who led armies to victory, and a prisoner of war burned by the very church that would later call her a saint. By the end of this journey, you will understand the tangled web of faith, politics, and mystery that surrounds this legendary figure. How did a farmer's daughter from a remote village command the future king of France? What secret did she whisper that made a skeptical ruler believe her divine mission? We are about to trace her incredible path, from humble fields to royal courts to a fiery execution, separating documented fact from enduring legend. What does it take for a single voice to change the course of history? Her world was a small village nestled in the rolling hills of eastern France. Domrémy was a place of simple rhythms, where life was measured by the seasons, the church bells, and the safety of the local livestock. For a girl born around the year 1412, this was the entire universe. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was not a destitute peasant but a farmer of some local standing, a man who served as the village dean, collecting taxes and helping to maintain order. Their home was a sturdy stone house, which still stands today, a testament to a family that was rooted and respected. Yet this pastoral existence was framed by a constant, looming shadow. The 100 Years' War between France and England was not some distant conflict. It was a visceral reality. Domrémy lay in a contested border region, loyal to the French crown, but perilously close to lands controlled by the Burgundians, who were allied with the English. Raids were a constant threat. The villagers would have known the smell of smoke from a neighboring hamlet put to the torch, the sight of refugees fleeing with whatever they could carry. This was the air Joan breathed, a childhood where faith was your comfort and danger could arrive with the sunrise. As the daughter of a farmer, her education was precisely what you would expect for a girl of her station, which is to say, there was almost none. She did not learn to read or write. Her world was one of oral tradition, of stories told by the hearth, of prayers memorized from hearing the Mass. She learned the skills deemed necessary, spinning wool, sewing, and likely helping with the animals and the simpler farm tasks. Above all, she was immersed in the deep, fervent, and utterly conventional Catholic piety of her time. The village church, dedicated to Saint Remigius, was the heart of community life. Faith was not an abstract concept. It was a daily practice, a source of strength, and the explanation for both good fortune and terrible suffering. In this environment, visions of saints were not necessarily seen as impossible, but they were certainly not expected to visit an illiterate teenager tending sheep in the meadows. This is the crucial backdrop, the perfectly ordinary soil from which an utterly extraordinary story would grow. Everything about Joan's early life pointed toward a predictable future: marriage to a local boy, a life of work and prayer within the confines of her village, her horizons limited to the hills she could see from her doorstep. There was no hint of military genius, no training in statecraft, no exposure to the corridors of royal power. She was, by every outward measure, completely unprepared for what was to come. That is what makes the rupture so profound. The voices she first heard in her father's garden around the age of 13 did not just speak to her. They shattered the boundaries of that small, predictable world. They initiated a secret life, a hidden dialogue that would compel this ordinary girl to make an impossible demand of her king, and in doing so, bend the arc of history itself. The first voice came on a quiet afternoon, a sudden brilliance in her father's garden. Joan was around 13 years old, and she described it as a great light, and from that light, a voice spoke. It was the Archangel Saint Michael, commander of the heavenly host. He was not gentle at first. His message was simple and terrifying: be good, go to church often. But soon, the voices multiplied and clarified. Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch joined Saint Michael, forming a celestial council that would guide her for the rest of her life. These were not shadowy figures. Joan described them with vivid detail: their faces, their crowns, even the sweet fragrance that sometimes accompanied them. Her experiences were both visual and auditory. She saw the saints as clearly as one might see a person standing in the room. and she heard their counsel directly in her ears. To understand this, we must step into the medieval mind. Visions and mystical experiences were not seen as signs of madness, but as potential conduits of divine will. The air of the time was thick with faith, where the spiritual world was considered just as real, and often more powerful, than the physical one. Many holy men and women reported visions, but almost none were teenage peasant girls instructed to take up arms. Joan was initially terrified. She wept and resisted. Who wouldn't? The weight of such a revelation was immense. She was a devout girl who knew her place in the world, and her place was not arguing strategy with angels. But the voices were persistent and patient. Over several years, they schooled her in her purpose. Their command became unmistakable. You must go to France, raise the siege of the city of Orleans, and then lead the Dauphin Charles to his sacred coronation at Reims Cathedral. This was the core of her personal mystery, a secret life of divine conversation that forged an unshakable conviction. While her neighbors saw a pious girl spinning wool, Joan was internally preparing for a war she had never seen, steeling herself to deliver a message that would sound like madness to anyone else. The voices gave her a map for a journey that seemed impossible, from a village garden to the throne room of a fractured kingdom. The voices gave her a map, but Joan still had to take the first step. That step led not to a royal palace, but to a nearby fortress town called Vaucouleurs, the seat of a local military captain loyal to the Dauphin. Her mission was simple and audacious. She needed an armed escort to travel across hostile territory to the court at Chinon. The man she had to convince was Robert de Baudricourt, a hardened, pragmatic soldier. In May of 1428, a 16-year-old Joan, accompanied by a family friend, stood before him. Her request was breathtaking. She told him she was sent by God to raise the siege of Orleans and see the true king crowned. Baudricourt's reaction was exactly what you would expect. He laughed. He told her friend to take her home and give her a good slap. It was a crushing, humiliating rejection. She returned to Domrémy, but the voices did not relent. They grew more urgent, telling her she must try again. For nearly a year, she lived in a state of suspended animation, performing her daily chores while internally wrestling with a divine imperative that the world refused to acknowledge. Then, in January of 1429, events conspired to bring her back. The English siege of Orleans was tightening, and a sense of desperation was spreading through the French loyalists. Joan, perhaps aided by an uncle, made the journey to Vaucouleurs once more. This time, something had shifted. She stayed in the town, her pious demeanor and unwavering certainty beginning to win over some of the townsfolk, and even a few of Baudricourt's own men. Then came a pivotal moment, a flash of the uncanny that turned skepticism into wary curiosity. While in Vaucouleurs, Joan abruptly announced a French military defeat near Orleans, describing soldiers falling on the field and even naming the exact location. Days later, messengers arrived with news of the Battle of the Herrings, a disastrous French loss that matched her description. It was a prediction she could not have possibly known through normal means. For the skeptical Baudricourt, this was the first piece of evidence that could not be easily dismissed. It was one thing to hear a peasant girl talk of visions. It was another to hear her accurately report a battle happening over 100 miles away, before the official news had arrived. Finally convinced, or at least convinced enough to pass the problem to a higher authority, Baudricourt agreed. He provided Joan with a small escort of men-at-arms and a simple suit of male clothing, a practical necessity for the dangerous journey through Burgundian-controlled lands. The transformation was now external. She cut her hair short and donned the garments of a page, shedding the visible identity of a village girl to become the figure her voices commanded her to be. This was no symbolic act. It was a matter of survival and propriety, offering both protection on the road and a semblance of authority. In late February, this small, improbable party set out on the perilous 11-day journey to Chinon. Joan was leaving everything she knew behind, armed only with an unshakable faith and a prediction that had already proven true once. She was walking directly into the lion's den, to the court of a prince known for his indecision, to present a claim more extraordinary than any he had ever heard. The court at Chinon was a fortress of whispers and doubt. When Joan arrived in early March of 1429, she was entering the heart of a kingdom on the brink of collapse. The man she called her Dauphin, Charles VII, was a figure shrouded in humiliation. By treaty, his own mother had declared him illegitimate, stripping him of his right to the French crown. He was indecisive, impoverished, and surrounded by advisors who viewed each other with suspicion. The arrival of a teenage girl from the borders claiming divine instruction was, at best, a curious distraction, at worst, a dangerous joke. Before she could even see Charles, she was subjected to days of questioning by priests and theologians. They probed her faith, her motives, and the nature of her voices, trying to determine if she was a heretic, a hysteric, or something else entirely. She answered with a simple, stubborn clarity that disarmed their complex theological traps. Finally, permission was granted for an audience, but this would be no simple introduction. It was to be a test. The famous story, embellished by legend, tells of a grand hall filled with courtiers. The Dauphin, perhaps skeptical or wishing to test her divine sight, hid among the crowd, placing a more plainly dressed courtier on the throne. As Joan entered, she reportedly walked past the impostor king without a glance. She moved directly through the murmuring crowd to Charles, who stood trying to look inconspicuous, and knelt before him. "Gentle Dauphin," she is said to have declared, "I am Joan the Maid, sent by God to bring aid to you and to the kingdom." How did she know? The theories are as varied as the historians who study them. Some believe it was divine guidance, the voices of her saints pointing the way. Others suggest a more earthly explanation, that a sympathetic courtier, perhaps impressed by her sincerity during the earlier interrogations, secretly described Charles to her. Another possibility is that it was a staged piece of political theater, orchestrated by a faction around Charles, who saw in this visionary peasant a potent new symbol to rally the weary French troops. The truth of that moment in the hall is forever blurred, but what happened next in a private chamber is the deeper, enduring mystery. Joan and Charles spoke alone for several minutes. We know only the result, not the content. When they emerged, Charles's demeanor had changed. He was visibly moved. Some witnesses said he looked as if he had seen a ghost. Joan had told him something, a secret so powerful that it erased his doubts. What could it have been? The most popular legend, repeated for centuries, is that she revealed the content of a private prayer Charles had made to God, asking for a sign that he was the true king. Another theory is that she confirmed a hidden fear or ambition he had shared with no one. The secret died with them. This private revelation was the key that unlocked royal support. Why did Charles, a famously cautious man, take such a monumental risk? His motivations were a complex blend of desperation and shrewd calculation. Militarily, the situation was dire. Orleans was the last major loyalist city holding the line against the English advance. If it fell, the cause was likely lost. He had tried everything else, and nothing had worked. Joan offered a new kind of weapon, not just another army, but a story. She was a living symbol, a pure, divinely inspired figure who could transform a dynastic squabble into a holy war. By backing her, he was not just employing a strategist, he was harnessing a prophecy. If she succeeded, it would prove God was on his side, legitimizing his contested crown in the most powerful way imaginable. If she failed, she was just a mad peasant he could disavow. For Charles, it was a gamble with potentially infinite rewards. He gave her armor, a household, and a place at the head of his army. The girl from Domrémy was now the Maid of Orleans, and an entire nation held its breath to see what would happen next. Charles had given his tentative support, but the path to Orleans was still blocked by a wall of learned men. Before she could lead a single soldier, Joan had to pass the ultimate test of orthodoxy. She was sent to the city of Poitiers, where a formal commission of inquiry awaited her. This was not a military briefing, it was a theological trial by committee. For 3 weeks, she was questioned daily by a rotating panel of the kingdom's most formidable minds, bishops, theologians, doctors of law, and high-ranking clerics loyal to the Dauphin. Their task was not to praise her, but to probe for weakness, heresy, or madness. The future of the French cause, and Joan's own life, hung on her answers. The questions came from every angle. They demanded a sign from God to prove her mission, to which Joan famously replied, "In the name of God, I did not come to Poitiers to give signs." "Take me to Orleans, and I will show you the signs I was sent to make." They interrogated her about the nature of her voices, asking how she could be sure they came from God and not demonic illusions. Her responses were grounded in simple, vivid faith. She described the comfort they brought, the light that accompanied them, and the moral guidance they provided. They pressed her on her insistence on wearing men's clothing, a serious breach of social and religious convention. Her justification was pragmatic and spiritual. The attire was necessary for protection, modesty while living among soldiers, and it was a command from her voices, a part of her divine duty. Throughout this grueling process, the peasant girl held her own against the most educated men in France. She displayed a startling memory, quoting scripture she had only ever heard spoken, and a sharp wit that turned their complex traps back on them. When asked if God hated the English, she replied that of any love or hate God held for them, she knew nothing, but she was certain God wanted them driven from France. The commissioners were looking for pride, for doctrinal error, for any hint of the hysterical. What they found disarmed them. Their final report noted they discovered in her only humility, virginity, devotion, honesty, and simplicity. The physical examination by a panel of matrons, a deeply invasive but standard procedure for a female visionary, confirmed her claim of virginity, which in their world was a powerful marker of purity and a shield against accusations of witchcraft. The verdict was a masterpiece of cautious endorsement. They declared they had found nothing evil in her, only a good Christian life and character. They could not definitively prove her mission was from God, but crucially, they found no reason to deny it might be. For Charles, this was the green light he needed. The churchmen had not condemned her, which meant he could use her without fear of immediate excommunication. The Poitier's examination transformed Joan from a curious anomaly into an officially sanctioned instrument. She left the city not as a suspect, but as the maid, carrying with her a banner of faith and a fragile, hard-won license to lead an army to its destiny at Orleans. The verdict from Poitiers was not an endorsement, but a permission slip. Now, the symbol had to be forged into a weapon. Joan was outfitted for war. A suit of armor was commissioned, custom-made to fit her frame. Contemporary accounts describe it as white, a brilliant, polished steel that would have made her a shining beacon on the battlefield, visible to friend and foe alike. More important to her than any sword was her banner, a standard of white linen sprinkled with fleurs de lis, the image of God holding the world, and the names Jesus Maria. She told her judges later that she loved her banner 40 times better than her sword, for it was a sign of peace, carried so she would never have to strike a lethal blow herself. Yet a sword she needed, and here the story takes another legendary turn. She directed messengers to the Church of St. Catherine de Fierbois, a shrine she had passed on her journey to Chinon. She told them to dig behind the altar, where they would find an ancient blade. Astonishingly, they did. Rusted and forgotten, they cleaned it to reveal 5 crosses engraved on the blade. It was said to be the sword of Charles Martel, the savior of Christendom, hidden centuries before. Whether a miraculous discovery or a clever piece of stagecraft, the sword became a powerful relic, a physical link between Joan's mission and France's glorious past. But what of her actual military skill? This illiterate girl was now to command hardened, skeptical veterans. She received no formal training in swordsmanship or siegecraft. Her education was immediate and practical. She learned to ride a war horse, a difficult skill she reportedly mastered with startling speed. She observed, she listened, and she insisted. Her primary role, at least initially, was not as a field general drawing complex plans, but as a unifying commander and a moral authority. She imposed a strict code of conduct on the army, banishing the camp followers and prostitutes, insisting the men confess their sins, and turning the march toward Orleans into something resembling a religious procession. This purged the force of much of its disorder, and in the minds of the soldiers, purified them for a holy task. Her relationship with seasoned commanders, like the young Duke of Alençon whom she warmly called, "my fair Duke," was one of mutual respect, tempered by bewilderment. They valued her for the hope she inspired in the troops, a hope that translated into desperate courage, but did they follow her tactical advice? The record is mixed. She displayed a keen, intuitive grasp of morale and momentum. She advocated for bold, direct action over the cautious counsels of the older captains. She insisted on attacking the English fortifications surrounding Orleans head-on, believing hesitation was a sin against God's will. Was she a strategic genius? Probably not in the classical sense. She made mistakes, often charging ahead without full support, but her genius was of a different, perhaps more potent kind. She possessed an unshakable certainty that broke the spell of French defeatism. For years, the English had seemed invincible. Joan shattered that myth simply by refusing to believe it. She was the living embodiment of a new story, one where God fought for France, as the army, now believing itself an instrument of divine will, finally approached the besieged city of Orleans in late April of 1429. The question hung in the spring air. Would this faith be enough to break a military stranglehold that had lasted for months? The fate of a kingdom now rested on the shoulders of a girl in white armor, riding under a banner she loved more than any sword, toward a city waiting for a miracle. Orleans was a city choking on despair. By late April of 1429, the last major French stronghold north of the Loire River was completely encircled by a ring of English fortifications, massive earthwork forts called bastilles that blocked every road and river approach. The defenders were exhausted, their supplies dwindling, and their hope nearly gone. The English commanders, confident of victory, had even sent mocking messages to the citizens, telling them to prepare for surrender. Into this atmosphere of impending doom, Joan arrived with a relief army. She immediately sent another message, this one to the English commanders. It was not a threat of force, but a command from God. She told them, in the name of the King of Heaven, to go away to their own country, or she would drive them out. The English response was a roar of laughter and crude insults aimed at the peasant girl they called the cowherd. They would soon stop laughing. The French commanders, still cautious, planned to resupply the city by sailing barges up the Loire, avoiding a direct fight. Joan insisted they enter Orleans itself to hearten the people. On the evening of April 29th, she rode through the Burgundy Gate, and the effect was electric. The citizens, clutching torches, swarmed around her as if she were a saint made flesh. They pressed so close to touch her or her horse that one man held a torch, so near it set her banner alight. Joan calmly spurred her horse and extinguished the flames herself, an act that seemed to the crowd like a miracle. Her mere presence had broken the psychological siege. For days, however, the seasoned captains hesitated, arguing over tactics while Joan chafed at the delay. Finally, she took action. On May 4th, while the main commanders were in a council of war, she suddenly rose, saying the voices told her to go attack the English. She rallied soldiers and townsfolk, and they stormed the outlying Bastille of St. Loup, capturing it in a fierce, bloody fight. It was the first French offensive victory in the entire siege. Momentum shifted irrevocably. The key to the entire English position was the mighty fortification called the Tourelles, a stone fortress built on the southern end of a bridge across the Loire. On May 7th, the French launched their all-out assault. The fighting was brutal, a day-long slaughter on the muddy riverbanks and the stone ramparts. In the afternoon, as Joan was scaling a siege ladder to lead a charge, a crossbow bolt struck her high in the shoulder. She was pulled from the fray, crying in pain as the arrow was roughly extracted. The commanders urged retreat to tend the wound, but after a brief prayer, Joan did the unthinkable. She returned to the front, seeing their wounded leader back on her feet, banner in hand. The French troops found a second wind. As evening fell, Joan planted her standard at the foot of the wall and shouted for one final push. The exhausted soldiers, inspired to a frenzy, surged forward and broke through. The Tourelles fell. The next morning, the English army, its strongest fort taken and its morale shattered, marched out of their remaining positions and retreated. The siege, which had lasted over 6 months, was broken in just 9 days after Joan's arrival. Her tactical contribution was not one of complex maneuvers, but of relentless, focused aggression. She overruled the cautious, defensive mindset that had plagued the French for a generation. Her strategy was simple: attack where the enemy is strongest, for God is with us. This was a dangerous and often reckless approach, but in the specific, supercharged context of Orleans, it worked. It broke the spell of English invincibility. News of the victory spread across France like wildfire. The Maid of Orleans was no longer a curious story. She was a living legend. She had done the impossible, and in doing so, she gave a broken nation something it had lost, the belief that it could win. Victory at Orleans was a spark, but to crown a king required a blaze. The English army, though bloodied, was not destroyed. It retreated northward, regrouping to block the vital corridor of the Loire Valley. For Charles to reach the sacred city of Rheims for his coronation, this path had to be swept clean. What followed was a whirlwind campaign, a stunning series of battles across the month of June 1429 that showcased a new, aggressive French spirit, with Joan at its heart. The first major obstacle was the town of Jargeau, held by the Earl of Suffolk. The French commanders, still hesitant, debated whether to besiege it at all. Joan cut through the doubt, urging an immediate assault. During the attack, she was again at the forefront, scaling a siege ladder as stones rained down. One struck her helmet so forcefully it knocked her into the muddy ditch below. She rose immediately, shouting encouragement, and the town fell within a day. This pattern of relentless momentum continued. The French forces swept west, capturing the bridge fortifications at Meung-sur-Loire and Beaugency with similar speed, isolating the remaining English army in the region. The English commander, Lord Talbot, a legendary and feared soldier, decided to make a stand. He gathered his best troops, his dreaded longbowmen, and positioned them in a strong defensive formation near the village of Patay. The French scouts discovered the English position. What happened next was a complete reversal of decades of warfare. Traditionally, the English would dig in, plant sharpened stakes, and let the French knights charge impetuously into a storm of arrows, as they had at the disastrous battles of Agincourt and Crécy. This time, the French commanders, including the Duke of Alençon and Joan, acted on the scouts' report with lightning speed. They ordered an immediate cavalry charge before the English archers could finish setting their defensive stakes. The result was not a battle, but a rout. The French heavy cavalry crashed into the unprepared English lines. Lord Talbot was captured, and the flower of English military strength in the Loire was annihilated in a single, brutal afternoon. Patay was a thunderclap. It proved the French could win a decisive open-field battle, shattering the tactical myth of English invincibility. Yet, even amidst these triumphs, tensions simmered. Joan's relationship with other powerful French leaders was complex. She had a warm rapport with the Duke of Alençon, but clashed bitterly with the Constable de Riquimont, a powerful noble who had been in disgrace at court. When Riquimont arrived with his troops wanting to join the campaign, Joan and the royal council initially refused him, fearing his political ambitions. He eventually forced his way into the army, creating an uneasy alliance where military success was shadowed by political mistrust. Joan's role in these battles was multifaceted. She was not the sole tactician, but she was the indispensable catalyst. Her presence guaranteed the morale of the common soldiers, who believed God fought alongside her. More importantly, she enforced a philosophy of constant, aggressive action that overrode the chronic caution of the French high command. Her goal was never merely to win battles. It was to fulfill a divine itinerary. Every victory at Jargeau, Meung, and Patay was a step on the road to Rheims. The coronation was not a symbolic formality. It was the entire point. In medieval thought, a king was only truly a king after being anointed with the holy oil at Rheims Cathedral, in a ceremony that reached back to the first Christian king of France. Charles, still called the Dauphin, was a claimant without that sacred legitimacy. By clearing the Loire Valley, Joan was building a secure highway for his sacred journey. She was turning military momentum into political reality, crafting a crown from a succession of stunning victories. The path to Rheims was now open, but the greatest test of her influence was about to begin, not on a battlefield, but in the council chambers of a hesitant prince. The road to Rheims was a victory parade through a liberated countryside. After the stunning triumph at Patay, the French army, with Joan and the Dauphin at its head, turned northeast. They did not march as conquerors, but as liberators. Town after town that had been under English or Burgundian control opened its gates without a fight, the citizens cheering for the maid and the king she served. It was a political avalanche, a demonstration that Joan's military success had fundamentally altered the loyalty of the land. By mid-July, they stood before the holy city of Reims, the spiritual heart of France. The Burgundian garrison, seeing the tide of history turn, simply abandoned their posts and fled. On Saturday, July 17, 1429, inside the soaring Gothic cathedral, the prophecy of a peasant girl was fulfilled. Charles VII was anointed with the sacred oil said to have been brought from heaven and crowned King of France. Joan stood in a place of supreme honor, right beside the high altar, her white banner in hand. When the ceremony was complete, she did something extraordinary. She stepped forward, knelt before the newly crowned king, and embraced his knees, weeping. "Gentle king," she said, "now is executed the pleasure of God, who willed that I should raise the siege of Orleans and bring you to this city of Reims to receive your holy coronation." In that moment, her mission was complete. Every hardship, every voice, every battle had led to this single point. The coronation was far more than a ceremony. It was a thunderous political statement broadcast to all of Europe. It transformed Charles from a disputed claimant into the Lord's anointed, the legitimate sovereign by divine right. For Joan, it was the ultimate validation. Her voices had promised she would see the king crowned at Reims, and she had. She stood there not as a general, but as the instrument of God's will, her banner, which she loved so dearly, now forever linked to the legitimacy of the French crown. This was the absolute peak of her power and influence, yet even amidst the pealing bells and the shouts of "Noel" from the crowds, the first subtle cracks began to appear. Charles, now secure in his sacred title, began to think like a politician rather than a desperate prince. His advisors, many of whom had always been wary of the peasant girl's influence, urged caution. They advocated for diplomacy with the Duke of Burgundy, the powerful French noble allied with the English, hoping to split the alliance through negotiation rather than force. Joan pleaded for immediate action. She urged the king to march straight on to Paris, to capitalize on the shock and momentum and liberate the capital. But Charles hesitated. He delayed for weeks, engaging in fruitless talks, while the English and Burgundians recovered their nerve and fortified Paris. The relentless drive that had characterized the Loire campaign seemed to evaporate. Joan, the unstoppable force, had met the immovable object of courtly politics. The divine timetable of her voices was colliding with the slow, calculating machinery of royal statecraft. The coronation had given Charles everything he needed from her, the sacred legitimacy he craved. Now he seemed unsure what to do with the living symbol who had delivered it to him. The warrior who had forged a crown was suddenly being asked to sheathe her sword, and the frustration that would ultimately unravel her destiny began to simmer just beneath the surface of triumph. Paris was a fortress of stone and shadow, and its gates remained shut. The king's truce with the Duke of Burgundy proved to be a strategic pause that only helped the enemy. While Charles negotiated, the English rushed reinforcements into the capital, strengthening its formidable walls and its defenders' resolve. By early September, Joan could wait no longer. She convinced the king, against his better political judgment, to at least attempt an assault. The target was the Porte Saint-Honoré, a heavily fortified gate on the city's western wall. The attack on September 8th, the feast day of the Nativity of the Virgin, was a disaster from the start. The French forces were divided and lacked their earlier cohesion. Joan, true to her nature, led a charge directly into the killing zone between the outer wall and a deep defensive ditch. A crossbow bolt struck her high in the thigh, and she fell into the muddy trench. Witnesses said she cried out in pain, but refused to leave the field, urging the soldiers on from where she lay. The fighting raged until dusk, but the walls held. Then, from the king's command post, the order came, retreat. Charles had seen enough. He called off the assault entirely, and the French army withdrew. This was more than a military defeat. It was a profound symbolic rupture. For the first time, the divine momentum that had carried Joan from Orleans to Reims had decisively stalled. The king who owed his crown to her boldness now chose caution over her counsel. His motives were coldly political. With his coronation complete, Charles's primary goal shifted from liberation to consolidation. He believed a negotiated settlement with Burgundy, which would fracture the English alliance, was more valuable than a bloody street fight for Paris. Joan represented the opposite, an uncompromising vision of total victory ordained by God. To the court, her insistence began to look less like prophecy and more like dangerous obstinacy. In the weeks that followed, the royal support that had armored her began to dissolve. The king disbanded much of the army for the winter, a clear signal that the great offensive was over. Joan was sidelined, her military advice ignored. Her presence at court now an uncomfortable reminder of a divine mandate the king preferred to interpret more flexibly. The frustration for Joan must have been a physical ache, deeper than the wound in her thigh. She had been the instrument of a miracle, only to be told the miracle was now inconvenient. The voices, however, did not cease. They still urged her to fight, to complete the liberation of France. This left her trapped between a heavenly command and an earthly king who had stopped listening, a dangerous place for a visionary who no longer served a political purpose. The frustration of that failed Paris assault lingered through a long, inactive winter. By the spring of 1430, Joan was chafing against her enforced idleness at court. The voices, she insisted, still commanded her to fight. With the king's formal armies disbanded or occupied elsewhere, she took matters into her own hands. She gathered a small, independent company of loyal volunteers, funded by the Duke of Alençon and others who still believed in her. Their goal was not a grand campaign, but a series of smaller actions to relieve towns along the Oise River that were threatened by Burgundian forces. It was a return to her roots, leading a band of believers, but without the overwhelming royal support that had shielded her before. The air of invincibility had thinned. Her final destination was the town of Compiègne, a loyal French stronghold north of Paris that was under increasing pressure from the Duke of Burgundy's troops. She arrived there on May 14th, just as a Burgundian army, bolstered by English advisors, began to encircle the town. The defense of Compiègne was a desperate, piecemeal affair. On the evening of May 23rd, Joan led a sortie, a sudden attack from the town gates aimed at disrupting a Burgundian camp. The initial charge was successful, driving the enemy back. But Burgundian reinforcements arrived swiftly, turning the tide. The French found themselves outflanked and outnumbered. A chaotic retreat began back toward the town gates. Joan, true to her nature, placed herself at the very rear of the retreating force, fighting to cover the escape of her men. As the panicked soldiers funneled back across the drawbridge and through the gatehouse, the unthinkable happened. The town's governor, fearing the Burgundians would storm in on the heels of the retreat, gave the order. The massive portcullis, an iron grate, slammed down. The drawbridge began to rise. Joan was left on the wrong side, trapped on the riverbank with a closing circle of enemy soldiers. What happened in that moment remains one of the most debated and heartbreaking scenes of her life. Was it treachery? Had someone in Compiègne, perhaps bribed or politically opposed to her, ordered the gate shut at the precise moment to sacrifice her? Or was it simply a tragic misfortune, the panicked act of a garrison commander trying to save his town? We will never know for certain. What we do know is that a Burgundian archer, a man named Lionel, seized her by her rich surcoat and pulled her from her horse. She was captured. The maid who had led armies was now a prisoner of war. The news traveled across Europe with the speed of a shockwave. In France, a profound despair settled over the loyalist regions. The symbol of their resurgence was gone. In England and Burgundian territories, there was jubilation. They had not just captured a troublesome commander, they had captured the very spirit of the French resistance. For her captors, Joan was a political and financial prize of immense value. The Burgundian soldier who captured her did not keep her for long. He sold her to his commander, Jean de Luxembourg, who in turn began negotiations. The English were desperate to get their hands on her. They paid a king's ransom, literally. The sum was 10,000 livres tournois, a fortune equivalent to the annual income of a high noble. But this was not a simple prisoner transfer. It was a carefully orchestrated legal and political maneuver. The English needed more than her body. They needed to destroy her legend. If they executed her as a mere prisoner of war, she would become a martyr, her myth growing even stronger in death. But if they could have her condemned by the church as a heretic and a witch, then her victories would be tainted as the work of the devil, and King Charles' divinely sanctioned coronation would be rendered illegitimate. Her capture was just the beginning. Now the real battle would begin, not on a field of mud and blood, but in a courtroom, where her faith and her voices would be put on trial for her life. The iron portcullis at Campigny was the end of one story and the beginning of another far more sinister one. After months of being shuffled between Burgundian castles, a political pawn in a financial negotiation, Joan was finally sold to the English. They brought her to Rouen, the capital of English-occupied Normandy, and locked her away in a fortress that was the very heart of their power. This was not a prison for a prisoner of war. It was a cage built for a symbol they intended to break. Her first cell was in the castle of Bouvilleuil, a secular military prison controlled by the English Earl of Warwick. She was held in an iron cage, according to some later testimonies, her neck, hands, and feet clamped in irons and chained to a wooden block. The space was so small she could not stand upright. She was guarded day and night by 5 rough English soldiers of the lowest rank, men who mocked and threatened her. The promise made under church law, that a woman accused of heresy should be held in an ecclesiastical prison under the guard of nuns, was blatantly ignored. The English knew that in a church prison, she would be treated with dignity and have spiritual advisors who might support her. They could not allow that. They needed her isolated, terrified, and physically broken to prepare her for the trial to come. After weeks of outcry from the French churchmen involved in the case, she was moved, but only to a slightly better cell within the same castle fortress. Now she was chained by the leg to a heavy wooden block, and her guards remained. The psychological toll was immense. For a girl who had lived under open skies, who had ridden at the head of armies, this claustrophobic, fetid darkness was a special kind of torture. The constant presence of hostile men was a weapon aimed at her proclaimed purity and her spirit. She had no companions, no one to share her prayers with, no friendly face. Every sound, every clank of a key, was a potential threat. This was the carefully crafted environment for her interrogation, a place designed to exhaust her resolve before a single question was ever asked in court. The stage was now set, not for a search for truth, but for a meticulously planned judicial murder. The trial that began in January of 1431 was a masterclass in political theater disguised as Holy Inquisition. Its architect was Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais. Cauchon was not a neutral churchman. He was a creature of the English regime, a French bishop whose own diocese was under English control, and he was deeply invested in their victory. His appointment as the presiding judge guaranteed the trial's outcome from the very first day. The goal was not to discover if Joan was guilty, but to construct a public record proving she was. They needed to demonstrate that Charles VII had been led to his coronation by a witch and a heretic, thereby stripping his kingship of its divine legitimacy and returning the crown, in the eyes of Europe, to the English claimant. To this end, Cauchon assembled a court of his allies. The assessors, the men who would judge the evidence, were overwhelmingly pro-English clerics, university theologians, and canon lawyers. Not a single voice friendly to Joan or the French cause was permitted. The proceedings were a psychological siege, as relentless as the military one at Orleans. They began with a series of public sessions in the castle's Great Hall, where Joan faced a battery of questions from dozens of men. The questions were intricate traps, designed to ensnare her in theological error or force her into an admission of pride or disobedience. They circled endlessly around 2 central themes, the nature of her voices and her insistence on wearing male clothing. When asked if she was in a state of grace, a question meant to trap her into either claiming a sinless perfection only God could grant or admitting she was a sinner. She gave a famously brilliant reply. "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was an answer of humble faith that left her interrogators speechless. They pressed her on why she needed an angel to bring a message if she could pray directly to God. They demanded to know if St. Margaret spoke English. They asked her to describe the angels, probing for any detail they could twist into an accusation of idolatry or demonic illusion. Through it all, this illiterate young woman displayed a composure and a sharpness of mind that utterly frustrated her learned judges. She parried their complex theology with simple, stubborn faith. She corrected them on minor points of fact from her own life. She remembered the details of previous questioning with perfect clarity, often reminding the court of answers she had already given. When they tried to force her to swear an oath to answer every single question they might ask, she refused, saying she would answer freely about matters of faith, but not about every private word she had said to her king. This was not the broken, confused prisoner they had expected. This was a formidable intellect, armored in certainty. As the public sessions wore on, it became clear their strategy was failing. Joan was winning the battle of wits in the open court, so Kachan shifted tactics. He moved the interrogation into the privacy of her prison cell. Here, without the formal structure of the public hall, small groups of judges would visit her, badgering her with the same questions over and over, trying to catch her in a contradiction or wear down her resolve through sheer exhaustion. The chains, the hostile guards, the endless circular questioning, it was all a grinding machine meant to break her spirit. Yet, even in the gloom of her cell, she held the line, defending her voices and her mission with a clarity that continued to defy the most powerful men in Normandy. The legal net, however, was being woven from 1,000 threads, and her steadfastness itself was being recorded as proof of a different crime, the sin of prideful disobedience to the authority of the church on earth. The male clothing became the noose they used to hang her. In the eyes of the medieval church, this was not a matter of fashion, but a grave sin against divine and natural order. The charge was rooted in Scripture, specifically the book of Deuteronomy, which stated, "A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God." For Joan's judges, this was a clear, unambiguous law. A woman in hose and a doublet was not just defying convention, she was committing an abomination, blurring the God-given boundaries between the sexes. This made her attire the perfect legal weapon, a visible, undeniable symbol they could use to prove her heresy and her rebellious spirit. Joan's justification, however, was grounded in a stark and practical reality. She did not wear men's clothing for pleasure or to reject her femininity. She explained it was a necessity for war, allowing her to ride, fight, and live among soldiers with modesty and safety. After her capture, it became a shield. In her prison cell, guarded day and night by hostile English soldiers, the male attire was her last line of defense. The heavy, layered garments, laced and buckled tightly, were a physical barrier, making a swift assault far more difficult. She told the court that her voices had commanded her to wear the clothes, and that she needed the permission of the church to remove them. It was a matter of obedience to God and a matter of survival. The trial transcripts reveal a relentless, almost obsessive focus on this single issue. They returned to it again and again, circling like wolves around a wounded deer. Then on Thursday, May 24th, they sprung their trap. They took Joan to a cemetery outside the castle walls, a place of solemn judgment. A large platform was erected, and a crowd gathered. They had prepared a scaffold with a stake and wood piled high, a vivid, terrifying preview of her fate. A preacher delivered a long sermon, condemning her errors. Exhausted, ill, and facing the immediate, visceral threat of the flames, Joan broke. She agreed to abjure, to renounce her errors. A document was read aloud, a long list of admissions they had prepared for her. She was to agree that her voices were false, that her visions were lies, and that she would never again wear men's clothing. Overwhelmed and likely believing this confession would save her from the fire, she made her mark. She could not write, so she signed with a rough circle, a symbol of submission. She was then formally sentenced to life imprisonment, to be fed the bread of sorrow and the water of affliction. In return, she put on a dress. For her judges, this was the ultimate victory. They had not just captured the warrior, they had broken the prophet. They had forced the maid, the symbol of invincible faith, to publicly deny the very voices that had defined her. It was a profound psychological annihilation, but the victory was hollow, and it would last only a few days. The dress was a prison more confining than her chains. For 3 days, Joan wore the garments of a woman, as she had promised in the cemetery. But inside her cell, the reality of her supposed mercy became clear. The sentence of life imprisonment meant a future of perpetual isolation in an English dungeon, guarded by the same men who tormented her. Her voices, which she believed had been silenced by her denial, returned. According to later testimony from a priest who visited her, she said the saints came to her again, and this time they spoke with sorrow and sternness. They reproached her for the terrible act of abjuration, for denying the truth they had given her. To Joan, this was not a temptation, it was a devastating correction from heaven itself. She had traded her integrity for a false promise of safety, and her divine guides would not let her live that lie. The psychological torment of this realization must have been unbearable. She was caught between the command of the church, which she had just sworn to obey, and the command of her voices, which she believed were the very mouthpieces of God. To obey one was to betray the other. In this crisis of conscience, she made her final choice. The male clothing reappeared. How it came back into her cell is one of history's dark ambiguities. The English guards claimed she willfully demanded it, showing her stubborn relapse into sin. Joan herself suggested a more sinister possibility, that her captors deliberately left the forbidden garments in her cell, removing the dress to force her hand. Whether by entrapment or by her own desperate need for the protection those clothes offered against her guards, the result was the same. When Bishop Kachan and several judges visited her cell on Monday, May 28th, they found her once again in hose, doublet, and short tunic. They questioned her urgently. Why had she done this? Had she heard her voices again? She replied, yes, she had. They had told her she had damned herself by making that abjuration out of fear, that in saving her life she had condemned her soul. With this admission, the legal machinery clicked into its final, fatal position. By putting on the male clothes and reaffirming her voices after her public renunciation, she had committed the canonical crime of relapse. A relapsed heretic was considered beyond redemption, having tasted God's mercy and willfully spat it out. The ecclesiastical court had now done all it was designed to do. It had extracted a confession, witnessed a recantation, and now documented a relapse. Its purpose was complete. On Wednesday, May 30th, they brought her before a final session. Kachan pronounced the verdict. She was a relapsed heretic. As a church court, they could not themselves shed blood. So, in a grim formality, they severed their ties. They declared her case closed and handed her over to the secular authorities, the English crown officials who had been waiting just outside the door. This was the final, cold transaction. The church washed its hands of her, delivering her body to the state for punishment. The sentence for a relapsed heretic under secular law was unequivocal and horrifying: death by fire. The trial was over. The political theater had reached its scripted end. All that remained was the execution. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, they brought her a simple, long shift of rough gray cloth. She put it on, the final garment. A company of English soldiers then led her from the castle, through the streets of Rouen, to the old market square. A massive crowd had gathered, pressing in from all sides. The air was thick with anticipation and the smell of a city preparing for a grim spectacle. At the center of the square stood a high platform of plaster, and upon it, a stake surrounded by a pyramid of firewood and straw. They led her up the steps. The official in charge read out the sentence of condemnation one final time. As she listened, she asked for a cross. An English soldier, moved by a sudden pity, took a piece of wood from a nearby crate, broke it to form a small cross, and handed it up to her. She took it and placed it inside her shift, against her breast. She then asked for a crucifix from the church, so she could keep it before her eyes until the end. A priest fetched one, and she clasped it, kissing it fervently. They bound her to the stake with heavy chains. As the executioner prepared to light the pyre, she asked him to wait, to hold the crucifix high where she could see it. She then began to pray aloud, her voice clear and strong over the murmuring crowd. She called upon her saints, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. But most of all, she called upon Jesus. Her final words, repeated over and over as the smoke began to rise, were a plea for forgiveness and salvation. Jesus, 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 she cried. The flames caught quickly, fed by the straw, and climbed the stacked wood. The fire spread, and her cries continued until they were swallowed by the roar of the blaze. What happened in that fire was witnessed by hundreds, and their accounts are hauntingly consistent in their emotional impact. Several reputable witnesses, including an English secretary and a friar, swore they saw the name Jesus written in the flames at the moment of her death. Others, hardened soldiers and Burgundian partisans who had come to rejoice, found themselves weeping uncontrollably. One English judge was heard to murmur in horror, "We are lost, we have burned a saint." The executioner himself, a man named Geoffroy Theurge, was reportedly seized with terror later that day. He confessed to a priest that he feared for his soul, for he believed he had executed a holy woman. The political goal had been achieved, but the spiritual and psychological shockwave had backfired on its orchestrators. To ensure no physical trace of her remained to become a relic for veneration, they ordered the fire stoked until her body was completely consumed. They then raked through the coals, gathering her ashes and charred fragments of bone, and threw them all into the river Seine. They believed they were scattering a heretic's remains to the winds and waters, erasing her from memory. But in trying to destroy every last piece of her, they only succeeded in making her legend indestructible. The ashes in the Seine did not extinguish her story. A quarter of a century later, the political landscape of France had been utterly transformed. King Charles VII, the hesitant Dauphin Joan had led to Reims, was now a victorious and secure monarch. The English had been driven from nearly all of their continental holdings, and Rouen itself was back in French hands. With his throne firmly established, Charles turned his attention to a lingering shadow on his own legitimacy: the woman whose heresy conviction had once tainted his divinely sanctioned coronation. To erase that stain, he ordered a new investigation, a posthumous retrial known as the Nullification Trial. Its purpose was not to determine Joan's guilt, but to examine the justice of the original proceedings that had condemned her. This was a calculated act of political hygiene, a way to formally vindicate the Maid, and, by direct connection, cleanse his own reign of any lingering doubt. The process that began in 1455 was meticulous and exhaustive. A papal commission, authorized by the new Pope Calixtus III, traveled to Rouen and Paris, gathering testimony from everyone they could find who had known Joan. They tracked down over 120 witnesses, old soldiers who had fought beside her, villagers from Domrémy who remembered the pious girl, priests who had confessed her, and even former clerks and assessors from the original trial who were now willing to talk without the threat of English swords. For the first time, the full picture of her life, from the garden in Domrémy to the stake in Rouen, was assembled from the memories of those who had seen it. The testimony was emotional and vivid. The Duke of Alençon, her old comrade, spoke of her skill on horseback and her purity. Her childhood friends described a devout, ordinary girl until the voices came. Even some who had sat in judgment on her, like the priest Nicolas de Houppeville, now admitted the proceedings had been deeply flawed, driven by hatred for the French cause. The Commission's findings were a damning indictment of Bishop Cauchon's court. They declared the first trial null and void, a legal fiction built on a foundation of procedural fraud and malicious intent. The judges had no proper jurisdiction over Joan, as she was captured in the Diocese of Beauvais but tried in Rouen. She had been denied a legal advisor, a right afforded to any defendant facing such grave charges. The so-called articles of accusation were crafted not from evidence, but from twisted interpretations of her answers, designed to incriminate her. Most damning of all, the court had willfully ignored the rule of canon law that required a woman accused of heresy to be held in an ecclesiastical prison under the guard of nuns. By keeping her in a secular, military prison guarded by hostile English soldiers, they had created an environment of coercion and terror that invalidated any confession they extracted. The verdict of 1431 was officially scrubbed from the record. This legal rehabilitation was far more than a historical footnote. It was the essential first step on the long path that would eventually lead to her canonization. By declaring the trial invalid, the Church removed the official label of heretic that had been branded upon her memory. It transformed her, in the eyes of the institution that had abandoned her, from a condemned criminal into a wrongly persecuted daughter of the faith. For King Charles, it was the final piece of political vindication. The woman who crowned him was now officially recognized as an innocent instrument of God, permanently cementing the divine legitimacy of his reign. Yet this careful legal process, for all its importance, could not capture the full, mysterious power of her legacy. While courts debated procedure, the people had already made their judgment. In villages and towns across France, they had never stopped telling stories of the maid, and in the quiet of their hearts, many had already begun to pray to her. The fire could erase a body, but it could not answer the question that has echoed for centuries. What was the true source of those voices? Modern perspectives offer a radically different lens through which to view Joan's experiences, framing them not as divine messages, but as symptoms of a mind under extraordinary stress. One of the most cited theories is temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that can produce vivid auditory and visual hallucinations, intense religious feelings, and a sense of profound conviction. The great light Joan described, the sensory richness of her visions, and her unshakable certainty could align with such neurological episodes. Other psychologists point to conditions like schizophrenia, which often emerges in late adolescence, just as Joan's voices began, and is characterized by auditory command hallucinations. Could her saints have been a complex auditory hallucination born from the feverish religiosity of her time, a psyche shattered by the trauma of living in a war zone? From this viewpoint, Joan was not a prophet, but a person experiencing a severe mental health episode. Her divine mission, a narrative constructed by a brain trying to make sense of its own broken signals. Theological perspectives, of course, stand in direct opposition to this. For believers, the medical explanations, while interesting, entirely miss the point. They argue that to reduce Joan's life to a pathology is to ignore its miraculous coherence and fruit. In Catholic doctrine, private revelation is a rare but accepted possibility, where God communicates directly with a soul for the benefit of others. Her voices urged virtue, commanded courage, and achieved a concrete, historically verifiable good, the salvation of France. Would a mere hallucination produce such strategic clarity, such moral force, and such world-altering results? The Church, through her canonization, has formally endorsed the supernatural interpretation, declaring her visions authentic communications from God, making her not a patient but a saint. Yet there exists a powerful middle ground, a counter-argument that challenges both the purely medical and the purely divine. It points to the undeniable practical genius of Joan's actions. Mental illnesses like schizophrenia or debilitating epilepsy typically involve disorganization, cognitive decline, and an inability to function in the real world. Joan displayed the opposite. She navigated the lethal politics of a royal court, outmaneuvered theologians in debate, inspired thousands of hardened soldiers, and made swift, decisive military judgments. Her mind was not fragmented, it was fiercely focused. Her character showed not instability, but an almost superhuman consistency and resilience under torture and imprisonment. This practical success poses the most difficult question for the illness theory. Can a debilitating neurological or psychiatric condition also produce a leader of flawless tactical instinct and unbreakable political will? It seems a contradiction. Perhaps then, the mystery is not in choosing one explanation over the other, but in holding the paradox. Joan's life forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the line between inspiration and illness, between the divine and the human mind, might be far thinner and far more mysterious than we are comfortable admitting. The voices guided a peasant girl to change history, and whether their origin was in heaven or in the unique wiring of her own brain, their impact remains etched in stone and in flame. But what if the divine hand was actually a human one, moving pieces on a political chessboard? Another layer to this enduring mystery suggests Joan was not a prophet, but a product, a carefully manufactured symbol created by a powerful faction at the French court. The prime suspect in this theory is Joan of Aragon, the formidable mother-in-law of the Dauphin Charles and a master political strategist. Joan's faction was desperately seeking a way to reinvigorate the French cause and secure Charles' crown. What they needed was not just another soldier, but a story, a pure, unsullied figure who could unite the people and sanctify the war. According to this view, Joan was discovered, not by saints, but by scouts. They found a deeply pious, charismatic, and fiercely patriotic peasant girl, and they trained her. Her secret whispered to Charles at Chinon, a piece of private information fed to her by Yolland's agents, a stunning revelation designed to shatter his skepticism in one private moment. Her voices could have been a code for instructions from her handlers, a way to cloak political directives in the language of divine command. Even the miraculous discovery of the sword at Fierbois fits this narrative, a staged piece of theater to provide her with a holy relic and cement her legendary status. From this angle, every coincidence looks suspicious. Her initial rejection by Robert de Baudricourt, a test of her resolve, or a necessary part of building her grassroots credibility. The theological examination at Poitiers, a friendly review by clerics already aligned with the royal cause, designed to give her a stamp of approval, not to find the truth. In this reading, Joan was the ultimate psychological weapon, a living piece of propaganda whose very existence was a campaign strategy. The idea is undeniably compelling, and it solves certain puzzles by attributing them to clever human planning rather than divine intervention. It paints her as a brilliant, willing, and courageous actor playing a role written by shadowy patrons. Yet, for all its intrigue, the political pawn theory stumbles against the raw, unpredictable force of Joan's own personality. Could any stage manager, no matter how brilliant, fully control the performance she gave? Consider the sheer physical and mental endurance. No amount of coaching can prepare someone to scale a siege ladder under a hail of stones, to lead a cavalry charge, or to endure months of imprisonment and a rigged trial without ever breaking character and naming her supposed handlers. Her responses under interrogation were not rehearsed lines, but displays of quick wit and deep, stubborn faith that constantly frustrated her judges. Most tellingly, when the political utility of the maid ended after the coronation, the puppet did not quietly retire. She fought on, desperately trying to fulfill the mission her voices demanded, even as her royal patron withdrew his support. A mere pawn would have faded away when the game changed. Joan did not. She became a liability, then a prisoner, and finally a martyr. While political forces undoubtedly shaped the stage upon which she walked, the person who strode across it, with all her conviction, her courage, and her confounding complexity, seems far too real and far too dangerous to have been anyone's puppet. Even after the ashes were scattered, the legend refused to die. In fact, some whispered that it had walked away from the square entirely. Within just a few years of the execution in Rouen, a strange and persistent rumor began to circulate across France. People spoke in hushed tones of a miraculous escape, claiming the maid had never burned at all. The most famous version of this survival myth centers on a mysterious figure known as Claude des Armoises. Around the year 1436, a woman appeared in the region of Lorraine, Joan's homeland. She bore a striking resemblance to the lost heroine, and she possessed detailed knowledge of Joan's family, her military campaigns, and the intimate workings of the royal court. She claimed, quite simply, to be Joan of Arc, saved by a last-minute substitution at the stake. This woman, Claude, was no shadowy hermit. She traveled openly, was received by noble families, and even managed to convince two of Joan's own brothers, Jean and Pierre, that she was their resurrected sister. With their endorsement, her credibility soared. She married a knight named Robert des Armoises, hence the name history remembers her by, and for several years she lived a public life, even receiving gifts from various towns that had once cheered for the maid. The story taps into a deep, almost primal human desire, the hope that a beloved martyr did not truly suffer that horrific fate. It offers a narrative of secret rescue, of clever doubles and bribed guards, a fairy tale ending where the hero slips away from the villain's grasp. The theory of substitution suggests that a different woman, perhaps another prisoner or a willing accomplice, was hooded or disguised and burned in Joan's place, while the real Joan was smuggled to safety by powerful allies who still needed her. It is a compelling fiction, one that adds a thrilling layer of conspiracy to her tale. Yet when held against the cold light of historical evidence, these myths begin to unravel. The execution in Rouen was a meticulously public spectacle, designed by the English to erase all doubt. Dozens of reliable eyewitnesses, from the executioner himself to English secretaries, Burgundian soldiers, and French clerics, left detailed, consistent accounts. They described seeing her face, hearing her cries, and watching the fire consume her. The Bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Cauchon, stood close enough to see her die, ensuring his political victory was complete. Furthermore, the idea that the English would have gone to such elaborate lengths, staging a fake burning after paying a king's ransom for her, defies all logic. Joan was their ultimate political prisoner. Her public death was the entire point of the trial, to destroy her symbolically and legally. Letting her live would have been an inconceivable risk, inviting the legend to return and reignite the French cause. The fate of Claude Desarmoises herself reveals the truth. Her comfortable existence as a nobleman's wife continued until the real King Charles VII, having retaken Paris, passed through the town of Metz in 1440. According to chroniclers, the king summoned the impostor. When she was brought before him, he reportedly looked at her and asked, simply, "Maid, my dear, you are welcome. Do you remember the secret between us?" She could not answer, for she had never been told the private words Joan whispered at Chinon. The game was over. She later confessed to the deception, admitting she had fabricated the story for fame and fortune. The survival myths, while captivating, tell us less about Joan's history and more about her enduring impact. They prove how deeply her story had embedded itself in the popular imagination. People so wanted her to be alive that they were willing to believe the impossible. This folklore is not historical fact, but it is a powerful testament to the hope she represented, a hope so strong it could, in the minds of her people, miraculously snatch her from the very flames. For nearly 500 years, she existed in a state of unofficial veneration, a folk saint of the French people. The official church had condemned her, then later admitted its court was corrupt, but it stopped short of calling her holy. To the farmers, the soldiers, and the ordinary citizens of France, however, she was already La Pucelle, the pure, martyred maid. Her memory was kept alive in local festivals, in whispered prayers, and in the very soil she had fought to liberate. This deep, popular devotion formed the bedrock upon which her formal sainthood would eventually be built. The political and cultural tides of the 19th century finally made that process possible. After the chaos of the French Revolution, which had rejected monarchy and often the church itself, a new France sought unifying symbols for its modern identity. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who fought for the nation, became a perfect figure for this purpose. She was embraced by Republicans, monarchists, and Catholics alike, each seeing in her story a reflection of their own ideals: faith, patriotism, and resistance. Her legend was no longer just a medieval tale. It was a national myth, powerful enough to inspire a country through the profound trauma of the Franco-Prussian War and the horrific trenches of the First World War. French soldiers carried her image into battle, and her name became a rallying cry against invasion, a direct line back to the spirit of Orleans. This resurgence of her as a secular and patriotic icon created the cultural pressure and the emotional necessity for the church to act. The formal cause for her canonization was finally opened in the late 19th century, a meticulous, decades-long investigation into every aspect of her life and virtue. The Vatican's process is never swift, and Joan's case was examined with extreme care, weighing every word of the trial transcripts against the testimonies of her contemporaries. The goal was not to prove she won battles, but to prove she lived a life of heroic virtue. In 1909, she was beatified, declared blessed, a major step on the path. Then, on May 16, 1920, in a ceremony of immense grandeur at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Benedict XV declared Joan of Arc a saint. The heretic was now officially in the calendar of saints. It is crucial to understand why. The Catholic Church did not canonize Joan for leading an army or for her military successes. Warfare, in itself, is not a path to sainthood. She was made a saint for the exemplary quality of her faith, her obedience to what she believed was God's will, and her profound courage in maintaining that faith unto death. Her voices were accepted as authentic private revelation. Her purity, her humility amidst fame, and her forgiveness of her persecutors were held up as models of Christian virtue. In the eyes of the Church, she was a martyr for the faith, not for France, because she was killed for her refusal to deny the divine origin of her mission. Today, her roles are multifaceted. She is the patron saint of France, a spiritual protector standing alongside the King Saint Louis. She is the patron saint of soldiers, invoked for courage and protection in battle. And, poignantly, she is the patron saint of prisoners, a title born from her long months in chains, offering hope to those who are captive and alone. From a condemned heretic to a folk hero to an official saint, her journey through history mirrors our own changing understanding of faith, nationhood, and what it means to be truly, unbreakably, devoted to a cause greater than oneself. Her sainthood solidified her in history, but it was in the realm of culture where Joan truly became immortal. Across centuries, artists, writers, and filmmakers have returned to her story again and again, each time reshaping the maid to hold a mirror to their own age. The first major literary portrait came from an unlikely and hostile source, William Shakespeare. In his play Henry VI, Part 1, written in the 1590s, Joan is no saint. She is a cunning, seductive witch, a dark sorceress who consorts with demons to empower the French. This was propaganda for an English audience, a dramatic reflection of the very accusations used against her at Rouen, transforming the divine maiden into a malevolent force to justify her execution. The pendulum swung dramatically 2 centuries later with the German playwright Friedrich Schiller. His 1801 drama, The Maid of Orleans, reinvented Joan as a figure of romantic idealism. Schiller's Joan is a tragic, poetic heroine, driven by pure emotion and a noble, almost superhuman sense of duty. He even famously altered history, having her die gloriously on the battlefield rather than at the stake, a change that reveals more about the Romantic era's love for sublime sacrifice than it does about Joan's true end. Perhaps the most passionate defender in literature was an American with no national stake in her story, Mark Twain. He spent 12 years researching and wrote a heartfelt biography, Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, published in 1896. He called it his best and most important work, far greater than his famous comedies. Twain's Joan is the ultimate emblem of moral purity and courage, a figure he presented as a rebuke to the cynicism and corruption he saw in his own Gilded Age America. The 20th century, with its world wars and shifting identities, multiplied her images exponentially. In film, she has been portrayed as a spiritual visionary in Carl Theodor Dreyer's Stark, Haunting the Passion of Joan of Arc from 1928, which focuses almost entirely on her face during the trial, to a gritty, traumatized soldier in Robert Bresson's minimalist trial of Joan of Arc. More mainstream portrayals, like the 1948 film with Ingrid Bergman, emphasized her faith and heroism for post-war audiences seeking inspiration. Later, Luc Besson's The Messenger in 1999 presented a visceral, brutal, and emotionally raw Joan, a portrayal for a generation skeptical of institutions and attuned to the psychological cost of war. In music, she has inspired operas by Verdi and Tchaikovsky, oratorios, and countless popular songs, from Leonard Cohen's meditative Joan of Arc to a punk rock anthem by the band The Damned. Each adaptation asks a different question. Is she a vessel of God or a victim of psychosis, a nationalist symbol for France or a universal emblem of resistance, a feminist icon who shattered gender roles or a religious mystic transcending them? Her story is so inherently dramatic, so rich with conflict, faith versus doubt, peasant versus king, woman versus army, individual versus institution, that it provides a perfect template. This incredible malleability is the ultimate proof of her story's power. We see in Joan what we need to see. The Romantic era found a romantic, the wartime era found a patriot. The modern era finds a complex teenager struggling with voices and purpose. The core facts remain, but the interpretation endlessly shifts, because her life touches on the most profound human themes: conviction, sacrifice, and the terrifying price of listening to a call that only you can hear. She is not a fixed statue, but a river, reflecting every light we shine upon her. So many pieces of the puzzle remain stubbornly out of place. We have followed her path, from the fields of Domrémy to the fire in Rouen, and yet the essential mysteries persist, defying any single, comfortable explanation. The true nature of her voices sits at the heart of it all. Were they divine messengers, as she believed and the Church now affirms, or were they the complex symptoms of a neurological or psychological condition, a brain under immense stress creating a narrative of cosmic importance? Perhaps they were neither, but a kind of profound personal conviction so powerful it manifested as external dialogue. We may never know, and that very uncertainty is what keeps the story alive, inviting each generation to wrestle with the boundary between inspiration and delusion. Then there is the secret of Chinon, the private words that melted a king's skepticism in a single conversation. That moment changed history, and its content died with Joan and Charles. Was it a revelation of a hidden prayer, a display of supernatural knowledge, or a piece of shrewd political intelligence fed to a willing instrument? The silence where that answer should be is a void that echoes with possibilities. Her military role is another enigma. She displayed an intuitive grasp of morale and momentum, a force of will that broke the spell of French defeatism. But was she a tactical genius, or a charismatic figurehead whose aggressive instincts were expertly managed by seasoned captains like the Duke of Alençon? The record shows both bold successes and reckless charges. Her genius may have been of a singular kind, not in drawing complex battle plans, but in understanding that an army's belief in victory is its most powerful weapon. Even her capture at Compiègne is shadowed by doubt. Was the sudden raising of the drawbridge a tragic accident in the fog of war, or a deliberate betrayal by those who feared her growing influence or sought to curry favor with the enemy? The question of whether she was sacrificed hangs in the air, unanswered. These unresolved threads are not flaws in the tapestry. They are what give it depth and texture. Joan of Arc transcends the simple category of a historical figure. She has become a symbol, a vessel into which we pour our own ideals and struggles. She is faith personified, the courage to trust an inner voice against all external ridicule. She is defiance, the willingness of one young woman to stand against the combined might of an army, a kingdom, and a church. Her story is the ultimate underdog narrative, a reminder that the course of history can sometimes be bent by the most unexpected hands. In our modern world, her legacy speaks to timeless conflicts. She represents the terrifying power of individual conviction, the idea that one person, armed only with certainty, can challenge the world. Her trial pits that individual conscience directly against the immense weight of institutional authority, a clash that resonates in courtrooms and protests to this day. We see in her a reflection of our own battles against systems that seek to define, control, or silence unconventional voices. And ultimately, we are drawn to her because of the mystery. In an age of data and definitive answers, her life remains gloriously, frustratingly unexplained. We are fascinated by the gap between what we can prove and what we feel to be true. Joan of Arc is more than a saint or a soldier. She is a perpetual question mark, a story that refuses to be solved, inviting us not to find an ending, but to continue the search for what it means to believe, to fight, and to remain unbroken. The story of Joan of Arc is a single, astonishing arc traced in fire and faith. It begins in a quiet village garden with a voice from the light and ends on a scaffold in Rouen, her ashes scattered on the river. In between, she remade a kingdom. Historians can map her route from Domrémy to Chinon, from Orleans to Reims, and finally to that prison cell in Rouen. They can analyze the political machinations, the military maneuvers, the legal corruptions, yet the very heart of the story, the essence of Joan herself, remains a beautiful and compelling enigma. We can surround her with facts, but we cannot enter the private chapel of her mind where saints spoke and a mission was forged. Was she a mystic, a genius, a patient, or a pawn? Every explanation illuminates a facet, but none captures the full, dazzling mystery of the whole. Her legacy challenges us in a profound way. It asks us to consider the power of unshakable conviction, to wonder at the courage required to follow an inner voice when the entire world shouts that you are wrong. In an age that often demands proof before belief, Joan's life is a testament to the fact that sometimes belief itself is the force that creates a new reality. She forces us to confront the possibility of the impossible, to remember that history is not only shaped by armies and treaties, but by visions, by voices, and by the stubborn faith of a single, extraordinary person. What do you think lies at the core of her mystery? Share your own theories in the comments below about history's greatest enigmas. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of the Maid, subscribe for more journeys into the figures who shaped our world, one impossible decision at a time. Thank you for joining the investigation.